achievements, and he has turned this upside down. He has argued and showed very powerfully, I believe, convincingly to me on this aspect, that Sharia the is a moral way of life, and the West is an amoral, self-aggrandizing privileging of the state and capital that, in fact, is responsible for the destruction of not only Sharia societies, but of the material world, the planet, as well as of the human spirit and connection. So he makes the argument that the reason Sharia cannot be implemented in the modern state is because the Sharia is fundamentally moral. Now, he understands the Sharia through, and here is my critique of halak. Again, it's a friendly critique, readjustment. Even when, in fact, one reads his book carefully, one finds a different way, a way to come out of it. But let me first present my critique as I see it in a simple way. He sees the Sharia through his classical formulation as an ahistorical ideal, and he sees the modern state through the idea of a paradigmatic structure that has certain characteristics, right? So he argues that those characteristics are sort of like 7, 8, such as sovereignty, that the state claims sovereignty, total, it's not constituted by any order from God or by justification from God, as it was in Islam, as well as in medieval Europe in different ways. It becomes a god of sorts. And then there is the bureaucratic control, rational bureaucratic capacity of the nation state, its legal codification rather than relying on custom and people's norms. It is a top-down law, monopoly on violence. It's amorality and self-preservation. The state's morality is what it needs to do in order to survive. And then citizens are told what is moral is what you do to help the state survive. And the cultural power to then create subjects, docile subjects, in order for them to be useful for the state. So the strength of this argument is to shake up and to rethink what we have imported from the West, but its weakness is that it fails to appreciate history and agency, those two things that I'm going to talk about, history and agency. This means more specifically that halak does not do three things sufficiently. First, the state is not the same everywhere, that even the model of what it is supposed to be is in fact in flux. So the state before globalization in the late 70s, early 80s was different than the state which becomes basically a security guard for multinational corporations and global capital afterwards. Before that, it's managed capitalism managed by the state in the wake of the Second World War. And before that, the state almost, when the two world wars take place, the state almost becomes a divine figure for which one dies and kills and so on and so forth. So the meaning of the state itself has been changing and it's in flux. Similarly, what the state provides, those services are changing, not services, perhaps the functions, one should say. So one mistake, in my view, that halak makes is that he takes his description of the state to be an essentialist reality, even though he describes it in terms of paradigms. So that's number one. Second, why it's in my view, why we need to challenge this is because in reality, the state is changing and it can resist. People have agency. People's our culture, our discourses, and most importantly, as I'll argue, Islam as a deen of fitra has the capacity to challenge. So that takes me to my second critique, which is that Islam is not reducible to classical Sharia, even though I love classical Sharia and I believe that it is the most authoritative and detailed, meticulous formation and representation of Islam, certainly in the past. But it is not Islam per se. Islam is far greater and a more powerful truth that is found in the human heart, that resonates with the human heart when the human heart encounters revelation and scripture. That's why we're seeing people all over the world come into Islam. So in short, sorry, if you could mute yourself, I appreciate that.
Ustad,
Islam,
please again make me co-host, please. আমি রশিদ সাহেব।
okay, I'll continue. Islam is more resilient than modernity, is the point I want to make. Now, a corollary to this point is the necessary role of politics and collective action in Islam, whether as armed struggle or resistance, revolution, as we witnessed in Bangladesh. So the third and final point is the absence of the engagement that we find in Halak with Muslim scholars, living Muslim scholars, thinkers, and projects over the last 150 years or so. Okay. So anyway, my third point was the absence of a sustained engagement that we find in Halak with the actual Muslim scholars. So he talks about Islamic movements such as Jamaat Islami and Ikhwan only in footnotes. And what's interesting is that when he encounters Maududi, for instance, he actually agrees with Maududi's description. So it's not quite that he is he's saying that it's impossible for Islam to exist, but rather he's making, I think of it as a rhetorical argument that you will have to fundamentally transform the state, or maybe in some way transform the state if you are to implement Islam. I mean, this would be perhaps a more it's a reading that I think it's a possible reading of his book. And knowing him, I think that as he engages more with the contemporary Islamic movements, that would be his approach going forward. You see, we should not talk about Islam as if it's a thing in the museum, as a specimen in a lab. As scholars are studying Islam, that is you and me, we are studying them and we are responding. And that, I think, is the most important fact about Islam, that Islam is more powerful than Orientalism, than the quote-unquote social scientists that study is Islam. And therefore, it's important to think of Islam, as Talal Asad argues over and over, that as a conversation partner, even perhaps a rival, in fact, a rival philosophical intellectual tradition that challenges the categories in which and through which we study. All this said, for Muslims, finally, the task of understanding and reconstructing any existing order is a mu'amala with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first and foremost. So we should never forget that even though modernity and liberalism and capitalism are hegemonic and they seem to be all powerful, but they aren't. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises, وَمَنْ يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ. So this optimism is fundamental to faith. in particularly Islam. So the struggle and resilience of Muslims in Gaza or in Syria and in Bangladesh against global powers, and in fact is only evidence that it is possible for us to resist, and not only resist particular regimes, but also it is possible to fundamentally change the terms of modern governance and economy. I apologize. It took quite a while for me to
No,
get
no,
to.
Dr. Anjum, thanks for your detailed answer to a quite intriguing question, I think. Now I
Johan,
would like to
can
sure,
I add a small
sure, Dr. Doha.
point to the point about Wael Hallaq's work and its reception and misreadings by the, let's call them ex-Islamists in Bangladesh, who are kind of using the Hallaq argument and selectively reading him to promote the idea that there is no future in thinking about politics through Islam. Let's call that broadly Islamism. Sure, that's a contested term, but I'm just using it. And I think this is where we have a kind of sophistry going on, both on the left and in the ex-Islamic camp, who are now collaborating to create a normative liberal state. Their point is that if Islam and the modern state are not compatible, then we should not think Islam, we should stop thinking about Islam as a political project. Let's secularize it. It's a private practice. People will have the rights to practice religion. In the political sphere, there is no value in thinking about Islam. This is a fundamentally wrong misapplication of Hallaq's argument. First of all, while Hallaq, who is a non-Muslim, have said publicly that he would have preferred to live in an Islamic governance and pay the tax rather than being in the modern state. He literally have said that in public programs in Arabic media. And so it's very, very important to understand that his concern is that the violence of the modern state is so overwhelming and the dominance of the modern state is so overwhelming that the Muslims should not have easy projects about trying to make them. If we try to draw something out of it, that it should not be so easy to make them compatible in the sense that it's just possible. So there has to be a sense of suspicion. Since he's coming from a Foucauldian kind of way of reading history, he's suspicious of things that are considered easy to adjust. So he's more concerned about the kind of violence that the state articulates and uses. And for Wael Hallaq, the liberal state itself is like that. It doesn't have to become a fascist state. It doesn't have to go through. It's simply a paradigmatic question. So I just wanted to make sure I just emphasize that part for the context, in the context of Bangladesh, how Hallaq is intentionally misread to actually engage in a lot of anti-Islamic projects, which are basically about let's secularize Islam, put this in the private sphere. Public religion is not really the important issue. That's just religion. So they have religionized Islam, and precisely they've done what Dr. Anjum was saying, that how massive and how robust Islam is as a tradition, as a conversation, as a discourse, that it cannot be reduced to even the Sharia. And so I think there has to be creative forms of imagination, and we could still keep Hallaq at the level of showing how violent and immoral the modern state is. Having said that, I think the next question would be, since we're stuck with the state, how, and we have a revolution, we have, well, in our case, it's an uprising, not a revolution. We have an uprising and a shift from a necropolitical regime to a new potential future. We have to deal with the state. We have to think about how to make sure that we have a state which takes care of the people, and masses of whom happen to be Muslim. This is why the Pakistan question, all these other questions are really, really significant for us. These are central, and we cannot just ignore them. So sorry, Shihan, you can definitely ask the next question. I just wanted to sort of contextualize it a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, sure. I was actually going to ask you about the Pakistani issue actually, but you actually said that before I say. Um, as you talked about the constitution of the new constitution or the probable constitution of New Bangladesh, right? As you know that the constitution of a country is very closely connected with the political history of that country, right? Uh, as you know that Bangladesh has gone through various phases. It was once a part of Pakistan, right? Islamic Republic of Pakistan. In uh, Not only it was a part of Pakistan, the people of East Bengal or Bangladesh vigorously supported Pakistan movement, and the Muslim League got the highest vote from East Bengal, right? Um, and then whatever happened from 47, 71, and that led to the disintegration of Bangladesh from Pakistan, right? So there is a debate, there's a recurrent debate in Bangladesh about whether the 47 is relevant to today's Bangladesh. They say that 71 has negated 47. The 71's Bengali secular nationalism has negated the two nations theory of 47, right? So Muslims being a separate nation, Muslims being a separate political community, this notion is false, right? So how do we address this issue, Dr. Doha?
Mhm. Thanks for that question. So I think the July uprising, the fundamentally one of the great gifts of the July uprising is that we're able to now open up and explode history as we used to know it, according to the Bengali nationalist secular narrative, which is that 71 is the emergence of the possibility of a secular nation state or a citizen state in the aftermath of the disintegration of Pakistan. And I think what we saw is that this July uprising signals that we have to return to the question of 47 in a much more historical way. So it's not reduced and it's not rejected. The Pakistan concept, and I was in a panel very recently with Salman Sayed, and he agreed also that Pakistan as a concept, is extremely important for all the Muslims of South Asia. It's one of those projects, whether failed or not, is fundamentally significant for the dignity of Muslims in the region. So it is something that we know that there are such massive communities in South Asia who are all in sympathy towards that project. Now, what the state does is a different question. How the Pakistan state failed, et cetera, what were the problems between East and West Pakistan? Those are different sets of questions. But it is really important for us to understand that 71, 72, right, was not simply about violations by West Pakistani on East Pakistan. That's not the only thing that had happened. So it's basically a very strategic maneuver by which India won the disintegration of Muslims in South Asia. And this is something we have to, and because this particular moment, even the uprising supporters who are secular, they're also saying it very clearly that we have a moment in which we're very much against what the Indian state has done to Bangladeshi sovereignty and its security. So this particular movement is fundamentally anti-Indian in that sense. The Indian hegemony, the propaganda discourse, the security and intelligence apparatus that was established that conducted the local war on terror in Bangladesh is something completely supported by and organized by the Indian regime. So what we saw in July was an uprising against that. So in that sense, it's a very important moment to reevaluate our own history. And in the last regime, they have articulated a very specific secular nationalist history, which this uprising rejects. So it's basically a negation of that kind of history writing. So I think in that sense, it's very, very significant. Another moment that's really significant, we had a moment like this in 1975 when the 71, 72 narrative was dismantled when when Mujib was gotten rid of, and when Zia Rahman came to power and brought in, I would call, some of us are calling it, there's Tariqul Huda and Abdurrahman Bari, they've theorized on it, they're calling it the Islam friendly state. So in other words, we're thinking about a situation in which there is the emergence of a state in which there is room for negotiation, so we can have a particular kind of constitution and a particular kind of bureaucracy and apparatus that supports the possibility of more Islamic availability. What Salman Said calls it in Fundamental Fear, the availability, a project that increases the availability of Islam for masses of people. So I think on those counts, it's really important for us to think about 47 as an inspirational moment of Muslims of the subcontinent standing up for their own history, for a new kind of articulation of political agency. And of course, within the context of the later in the 70s history, how in 75, the Bangladeshis have rejected the secular narrative of a particular kind of nationalism. And I think that's how we should think about 24 as an opportunity for us to bring back those kinds of historical questions and not to fetishize 1971 as this kind of moment in which Bangladesh was born. We are much bigger than the history of just a country. And this is really important that I mean, that's just scholarly also. It's just accurate to know that the history of Bengal is much larger than this small nation state that we have.
Thank you, Dr. Doha, for a detailed answer. Now, I would like to turn to Dr. Anjum. So I would try to continue on this line of inquiry. As some of the figures associated with the recent revolution, I mean, let me call them ex-Islamists, like Dr. Doha said. They have, in the process of refuting or like sort of refuting Islamists, they have raised a controversial point. So one of them said that the Bangladesh seceded from Pakistan because Bangladeshi Islam was different from Pakistani Islam, and Bangladeshi Islam is also different from Arab Islam, as if they have been impressed by Shahab Ahmed's argument of the plurality of Islam. So I'd like to ask Dr. Anjum, I mean, how should they address this problem? Because we actually see apparently that there are many madhahib, whether it's like fiqhi, jurisprudential, or kalami madhahib, or like different madhab of tasawwuf. So how do we address this question, Dr. Anjum?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Great question. But before I do, I wanted to make a comment about the discussion. Especially, I find it intriguing thinking about 71 and 47. And I want to invite Muslims, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, and the rest of the 50 plus Muslim states to think about the year 622, the year of Hijrah, right? Or the rather year zero of Hijrah when the Prophet ﷺ made Hijrah. That is what constitutes us. And I think that by trapping us within these divided post-colonial states, what these so-called liberals are doing is effectively they are thinking of themselves effectively as colonial subjects created by this colonial experience in which our very essence has been determined by, reconstituted by this experience, which was nothing but, if you think of yourself as creation of 622 of Muhammad, the Ummah Muhammadiyah, we are a people of the final messenger that was sent to humankind as rahmatan lil alameen, then you become you are the subject that has to look at, you are ummatan ukhrijat linnas, that you look at the colonizer as with pity, that it is you who have the burden, and it is this white man that needs his chains and the white woman her chains broken by the message of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. rather than constituting a world and a history and a narrative and a universe of meaning that is created by one of the most criminal acts in human history, that has been British colonialism and its continued manifestation today. But to look at your question of whether there is one Islam or many, whether one believes that there is one Islam or many depends on whether we believe in the message of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as being from one true God, or we are agnostic toward that and want to look only at the cultural and historical manifestations of Islam. So one of the things that social science does, it's, since Weberian social science wants to say that we're going to look at the world neutrally, and being neutral is objective and better and superior, and it is the truth. And but to say that a statement is true is just as opinionated when you say when a statement is false, right? So when you say that Muhammad ﷺ was a messenger of God, it's a statement that requires faith and it requires taking a position. But when you say that he's not a prophet of God, and I'm going to proceed with my life as if he's not a prophet of God, as Islam is not a religion sent by one true God, that is equally a religious statement. It's no less subjective, right? It is not objective social science to proceed as if that is the case. And that's the challenge of the social scientific observer. And that is a well-known problem of insider, outsider in the social sciences. And there is no easy answer to that. That can you really relate, as Talal Asad argues in his book, can you talk about, even as a social scientist, I'm talking not merely as a theologian, but as a social scientist, can you talk about a set of claims without taking a position toward those claims? There is no such thing as objectively studying an object that has a position toward you. You either have to agree with it or disagree with it about their understanding the nature of the world. And you could be a Westerner, you could be a kafir studying Islam. That's perfectly okay. I think we can benefit from that. But to pretend that somehow the anthropologist or the historian is more objective and more true when he denies my religious claim, but believes in fairy tales about enlightenment, then somehow that makes them more objective. So that's one. Now, secular fields cannot easily take divine truth into account because they have become philosophically tied to historicism, which goes back to Max Weber and remains the strongest tradition. But historicism, which means that the truth itself and every experience that we have is a creation of history, of human history, and there is no ultimate meaning. There is no sort of fundamental foundation. And I think that itself as a metaphysical belief, the rejection of truth claims itself is a truth claim, and it's a kind of religion. But apart from that, I think that even a secular social scientist can find in his or her tool set ways to overcome the lazy idea that there are many Islams. The recently published book by Shihab Ahmed, What is Islam, which is in itself a confused and flawed book. Most scholars in the Islamic studies field do not take it seriously. People more tend to talk about it on the outside of the field. But apart from its flaws, Shihab Ahmed is very clear that he rejects the idea of multiple Islams. So it's very odd that that is the idea that is associated with that book, but he's very explicit that he rejects that idea. And of course, we are familiar with Talal Asad famously in his 1986 speech and article, The Idea of Anthropology of Islam, famously talks about this notion, and it violates what Muslims across the world, from Jakarta to Marrakesh, believe. and say about themselves. So what kind of anthropologist rejects consistently what, even if you accept being a native, what natives are saying about themselves? And this is part of our theology. This is part of our observed reality. A Muslim can go anywhere in the world and pray in a masjid and feel at home. What kind of anthropologist would not lose his or her job if they said this about anyone else? So this is a clownish idea, okay? But of course, now this is to say that there can be local cultures and expressions of Islam. There can be different madhahib, right? The Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ disagreed with each other, and they agreed to disagree. You see, different madhahib are formed when people do not find shared system of ideas, anything that they share to explain their disagreement. They start from different points of departure and they separate. You could say that Judaism and Christianity at some point became different religions, but that's not the case with different madhahib. Whether they're legal madhahib or even theological madhahib, they're constantly arguing with each other, borrowing from each other, and in fact, merging into each other. And I can talk about that not only Shafi'i and Hanafi and Maliki and Hanbali, but even Shia and Sunni. If you look at the usul al-fiqh, legal theory of Shia, it's completely taken from the Sunnis, and not in a bad way. In fact, they have also contributed to it, but they came late to it. But my point is that similarly, sciences of hadith. So there is no sharp distinction, and on the whole, even when there are sectarian tensions, which are real, when they are formed politically, they exist and they are powerful precisely because people share, right? Sectarianism is formed when people share something and then they disagree on other things, and that's what creates this tension in identity. But Islam for Muslims has never been the name of how much chili you put in your food, or whether you raise your hand while bowing down in rak'ah and salah or not. It is the name of the unity created by the recognition of the truth that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. Right? If there is someone, a Muslim, or somebody who claims to be Muslim who doesn't believe that, then they are not Muslims. Even though they eat the same amount of chili as you do, and they laugh at the same jokes, and they look like the same as you, they may call themselves secular or liberal or whatever, but they cannot be Muslim if they do not believe in La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. On the other hand, somebody whose language you don't speak, somebody who lives in Arabia, Indonesia, or Central Asia, or in Africa, but they say La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, you're going to, when the time for salah comes 5 times a day, you're going to pray, stay next to them, behind them, with them. This creates a project, a struggle until the end of time to invite people to Allah and to become one as a people in worship of Allah. In short, we must, so what I've said so far, first we must reject lazy social sciences and this historicism that is philosophically, a fundamentally incoherent idea. If people want to embrace the denial of old truth and see everything as accidents of history, they should openly state this premise and try to defend it. I'm talking about historicism. But applying it to Islam selectively is just fashionable nonsense that has no philosophical self-awareness, nor is it established by good social science and historical inquiry. But I want to end my response by reminding us that there is the reality of a believer's relationship to the one true God, through which we affirm, as all Muslim authorities, Muslim scholars, historically have from all different madhahib, that those who submit to Allah are one ummah. Inna hadhihi ummatukum ummatan wahida. And this ummah extends not only in space from one end of the Muslim world to the other, and then non-Muslims as minorities, not only in space, but in time. since the age of Prophet Adam alayhi salam and Nuh to Ibrahim and Muhammad alayhim salam. And so this identity, this idea of unity, connection, and solidarity in space and time is essential to Islam. And this is despite the fact that Quran is very clear that your Sharia is different from the Sharia of Noah and the Sharia of Musa alayhi salam. But those differences are irrelevant to the question of there being in Islam.
Thank you, Dr. Anjum, for your answer. Now, I'd like to turn to Dr. Doha. Dr. Doha, as you know that there's a Shahbag Shapla debate in Bangladesh. So to contextualize for Dr. Anjum, I just want to say what it means actually. So we know about the Shahbag movement that happened in 2012 and 13, where the participants in the Shahbag movement, they demanded the hanging of GI leaders accused in like genocide in 1971. But their demands did not remain confined to hanging of GI leaders, Jamaat Islami leaders. They also demanded the ban of Islamic politics as well. And some of the leaders of that movement, they blasphemed Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in response to that, to protest that, we had a huge gathering of ulama and general Muslims at Shapla Square of Dhaka, right? So in the intellectual and the political circle of Bangladesh, so that's how the debate around Shapla and Shahbag arose. So obviously Shahbag represents the secular trend, and the Shapla represents the Islamic trend. So as we have seen the recent revolution in Bangladesh, there was one professor from Dhaka University who said that because this revolution used what he said Ijmali language, the inclusive language, and it's a revolution that included both secularists and Islam. So that's why this revolution brought an end to this Shahbag Shapla duality or dichotomy. So Dr. Doha, do you really think that this revolution has actually ended the Shahbag and Shapla debate?
Thanks for that question, Shihan. The one-word answer is no. It did not get resolved. And in fact, without Shapla, which was organized by the ulama, the largest platform of ulama in Bangladesh under Hifazat-e-Islam, when they were able to organize at that time the largest in the history of the country to protect the honor and dignity of the Prophet ﷺ against the secular bloggers and the secular movement of Shahbag, which, as you've noted, wanted not just judicial, they wanted public hanging of Islamist figures from the past. And what it showed was that as a society, there was a section, and the state reflected this, that wanted the war on terror publicly, and they wanted it to be openly articulated, and they wanted certain kinds of actions to take place against those who are coming from the Islamic tradition. And we saw the results of that. We saw that the state, there were judicial killings of top leaders of Jamaat Islami, and there were also extrajudicial killings and disappearances of many people. Many of them are oppositions who are not necessarily Islamists, but many were Islamist. And the entire structure of that was basically the logic of the war on terror. and using specific torture and interrogation sites. So first of all, let me just say that this is a big thanks to the movement in July that we're out of that now for the time being, even though there are many questions that are remaining. We have seen some people get out of torture sites. We're noticing certain kinds of media are able to return again to in Bangladesh and report on things. We're noticing that some of the basic human rights organizations are able to do their work and write the reports, etc. But the real crisis between Shahbag and Shapla, it is, one of the, maybe it's a fetishism of the academic language issue, but I see in social media people saying things like the binary of Shahbag and Shapla is finally going to be. First of all, it's not a binary, it's an antagonism. Those are two different things. A binary is when you have when you create a term to justify another term. So you create basically a term that's not really true to justify the effectiveness of a term that you want to support. So it's not a binary, it's literally an antagonism in society participating in literally propaganda for war against Islam. That's what Shahbag is. Shahbag is the articulation of a necropolitical state in its most naked form, a secular necropolitical strategy to evacuate Muslims out of their own history, of political history. So that's Shahbag. This was defeated by the uprising. Now, just because in the uprising, and we know, and let's be clear about facts, because this professor you're talking about who said that this is, the problem is resolved because many of the secular publics were participating in this July uprising. Sure, many people participated. There were several trends. But what is clear is that operationally and logistically, the success of this struggle, which was originally a student movement, transforming itself into a movement against the regime. If anyone in Bangladesh thinks that was possible without Islamic support, they're in fantasy land. They don't know anything about the country. They don't know anything about what the movement contained. So that's number one. So in other words, if Shapla was the articulation of a much more explicit kind of Islamic articulation for the defense of the Prophet ﷺ, then this July uprising and it was basically an idea to get rid of a regime that was concretized in Bangladeshi history, that was framed as a regime against any kind of Islamic possibility. So this is a very important transformation in that sense. So even though it was not explicitly Islamist, now there are debates about how a future state, how a constitution has to be organized. We know that we have entered into a new kind of secularism. We have to critique that, and that has to happen. And have the space of that criticism, that critique, has to be open. So that's why we're doing this. But I'm never critiquing without also acknowledging that something really big happened in Bangladesh. But we are entering a new era in which a different kind of secularism is emerging, which is much more disciplinary than necropolitical. And so that is something we have to discuss later. But to answer your question about Shahbag versus Shapla, what we see in July is the defeat of Shahbag at the level of mass movement. And it's not resolving Shahbag as if we can still be okay with Shahbag as an event. It's Shahbag as a moment in our history. Shahbag is a defeated force. And we have to be very clear about that. And every time it rises up, we need to defeat it. And everyone should be very, very clear. All the Muslims, the Shibir brothers, everyone. If Shahbag ever rises up, we're obligated to defeat it fully. There is no compromise there. There is no conversation there. They are a force that engages directly, militarily, with the security regime, with the intelligence apparatus against Muslims and against Islam. This is fundamentally the case. There is no debate about this part. So whenever it rises up, we have to smash that. This is not up for conversation. This is not going to be a discourse, a nice, a pat on the back. Shahbag has to be consistently defeated for us to actually have a proper state in which everyone can live decently without the Shahbagis, because the Shahbagis are engaged in literal war against the people. And that is fundamental to our basic ontological orientation in this new future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doha, for your answer. So let me go back to Dr. Anjum. Okay, Dr. Anjum, you have written a fascinating book. I mean, I'm personally fascinated by the book, the politics, law, and community in Islamic thought. So there, you have actually shown us that Islamic history presents us the true vision on Sharia and Siyasa. So one is, if you can remember the term correctly, one is elite-centered or the ulama-centric, and another is community-centric. Do you think that the modern Islamism, especially, I mean, if you look at Maududi's concept of theodemocracy or the popular vicegerency, I mean, that trend of modern Islamism can be categorized under the community-centered vision of Sharia and Siyasa. Dr. Anjum, yeah.
Yeah, right. No, excellent question. So my dichotomy was between a community-centered vision and a ruler-centered vision of Islam. Not so much the ulama-centered, because the ulama emerged later, starting in the late second and third centuries, as representatives of the people, and only over time, and in certain times and places, they became, one might say, a status group or a class. But going back to your question, I do believe that Maulana Maududi, rahimahullah, was seriously invested in a community-centered vision of Islam. He, in fact, provided some of the more commonly used terms throughout the world to refer to that version of Islam, or to that image or vision of Islam, whether it's theodemocracy or the Khilafah of the humankind. The theoretical challenge, however, that he faced, in my view, was about the boundaries of the community, which, what is this community that is being empowered? Now, in his moment, post-colonial moment, there wasn't much choice. But over time, as Muslim nation states developed, this became more and more of an issue of choice, whether we're going to think of our boundaries as defined by the nation states. And I think that particularly the moment of globalization starting in the 80s, and then in the 90s, the global war on terror, increasing a movement of people and money and information throughout the world after this in this internet age, has really fundamentally challenged the notion, the limits that we used to put on on what it means to be a community, and what causes one belongs to, and everything is supranational now. So that's why I think that this idea, Islam has become globalized. And so it's important to understand this as a moment of great historic opportunity for Muslims to become ummatic again. That when we think of the word ummah, right, you may use in Bangladesh or in Egypt or Pakistan as the ummah means the ummah of Bangladesh, the people of Bangladesh, or the people of Egypt, or people of Pakistan. But that's not the word ummah means, right? Those boundaries that we are putting are creation, once again, as I said earlier, of a colonial conspiracy of the worst kind. To internalize those boundaries and to take them as part of our theorization and meaning, I think is a great injustice and disservice to Islam and to our future. Which is not to say that I am not so critical of the nation state or not in the same terms as Professor Wael Halak. I don't believe that the nation state needs to be completely dismantled. I believe that we need to think of ourselves first. Our discourse needs to change, and then the institutions will change. We do need institutions and governance. We need good governance. We need governance that is Islamic. But the nation state as a sovereign entity that has this sacred history, that defined itself through 71 or 47 and all of that, that kind of, there's almost like it's a higher than religion discourse. I think that, that is what, in my view, overcoming the nation state, transcending the nation state involves taking that going beyond this discourse, thinking of ourselves as one ummah first, and investing in that. And that's actually extremely empowering for us. It's not merely a move driven by our aqidah, but in fact, you become much more empowered if you can respond to the Indian intellectual or the secular intellectual that is attacking Islam, and you can mobilize intellectuals and scholars and thinkers and resources, financial resources, business resources throughout the world to defend Islam in Bangladesh, the revolution in Bangladesh, right? So it's a great source of power, and so when I think of Maulana Maududi's community-centered vision, I do find that as a step in the right direction that actually has it has almost become, right, like contemporary Islamism, particular Islamic movements have really become much more open to the ordinary people. And that's almost by necessity. It was not necessarily a theological move. It was really the fact that a large number of people became all of a sudden literate and middle class, and they needed to be provided this a discourse that spoke to them. So I think that it was a natural outcome of modern development and education, mass education. And so what Abu al-Ala Maududi did was not to invent something out of thin air. You actually find origins of this in Egypt and more importantly in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. There where thinkers are thinking along similar lines. So it was a very organic Islamic development.
Thank you, Dr. Anjum, for your answer. Now let me turn to Dr. Doha. As you know that Dr. Doha, that there are some discussions in Bangladesh about demanding from Jamaat Islami to change its name. So the crux of the argument is that because Jamaat Islami had collaborated with Pakistan and opposed the independence of Bangladesh in 1971, that's why they could not garner much support for their political cause. And that's why they should change the name, and they should give the classical Islamist vision, move to more liberal direction. So what do you think, Dr. Doha? Should Jamaat Islami should change its name? Dr. Doha, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Sorry, I was muted for a second. I think whoever's managing the stuff, they're trying to mute other people. But anyway, that's a very good question. And of course, that's a big topic, as you know, in the national discussion whether Jamaat should change their name. Absolutely not. Why should Jamaat change their name? Jamaat should not be ashamed of their history. They have to be very, very clear about what their stance was in 79, why they thought that the nation of Pakistan was a conspiracy. And they should be clear about that. But it's been so long since then. I mean, Jamaat Islami as I said in 75, the constitution of the time, it allowed Jamaat to return to politics, and they've been in politics. I mean, there's no reason for them to be apologetic in order to exist in Bangladeshi politics. And they have to continue with their vision. And there is a pressure from ex-Islamists and post-Islamists to pressure Jamaat to lose their name of Islam and to have a new kind of orientation. And I think it's a conspiracy against Jamaat, and it's a conspiracy against the possibility of Islam as the political agency of Islam in Bangladesh. So I think that's very, very crucial. And on top of that, instead of focusing on these sorts of things about names and things like that, I think Jamaat should very much focus on getting justice for the crimes that were committed against them by the last regime specifically. Jamaat should not say, for example, and I say this humbly, that we forgive everyone. That's a very naive orientation. There has to be investigative, juridical, legal approach to get, even from this liberal state, to get justice for the killings done to their leaders that were completely unjust. It violated all international standards of justice, and the war crimes tribunal should be very seriously questioned. There should be efforts and committees created in order to resolve those sorts of problems that Jamaat has faced at the face of state repression and judicial repression. And so these are the things that Jamaat should be worried about, as to how to actually have their own space in politics. Because first of all, now in this particular moment, they have quite a bit of, I would say, uh, great resonance with the public. And so they should utilize this moment to create an opportunity to show that they're going to bring in a kind of a mode of political reasoning that is just. And they can, because they've been repressed so heavily, they should actually focus on how to get a certain degree of reparation for those major losses that they've suffered. So this whole idea of Jamaat, it's like so inverted, this kind of demand that Jamaat should change their name to adjust to liberalism. That to me sounds, I mean, it doesn't sound not just illogical, it sounds insane to have that sort of a demand. And then some in Jamaat actually entertaining that even as an idea. I think it's so undignified to do that. And we should know that in the last 13, 14 years, how much struggle the various traditions of Islamic activism had to go through. And this includes Jamaat. And so they have to be very clear that when they're speaking, they're also speaking of other Islamic orientations as well. And so it's very, very important. They're a very important voice for Islam in the country, and they should not lose their name. I think it is totally undignified, and it is also, in terms of political effectiveness, not a very good idea.
Thank you so much, Dr. Doha. Now, today's last question will be posed to Dr. Anjum. Dr. Anjum, as you heard Dr. Doha, talking about post-Islamism, Dr. Anjum, one of your research focuses is modern Islamism, as far as I know, and I'm quite sure that you know about post-Islamism, right? I know Dr. Asif Bayat and others who have basically talked a lot about post-Islamism and how in various Muslim countries, some of the Islamic movements are morphing into sort of like conservative democratic movements. And he's like depicting it as sort of like inevitability that eventually, like almost, I mean, if the Islamic movements have to remain relevant in the politics, they have to morph into like post-Islamism. So, Dr. Anjum, what do you think about post-Islamism? I mean, do Islamic movements really need to transform themselves into post-Islamist movements?
So I want to first say something about the question of uh, continuous with what Dr. Doha was talking about, the question of changing the name and what kind of politics. And I want to just add one thing to it. I think that there is a lot that young Muslim activists throughout the world can learn from the Gaza activism. One of the biggest challenges that I see in Islamic movements across the world is intergenerational gap, that our leaders tend to be old and are disconnected from the possibilities and the mood that's on the on in out there in the world. And it's important to, I mean, look at what happened with Gaza. It's a long process of learning for Palestinians. But one thing that happened is that there was unity. There were secular, even Palestinians who recognized that what this Tufan al-Aqsa, it was deeply, fundamentally religious Tufan, religious operation, but everybody came together. And you had folks from all over, especially the younger people who saw what was happening and what's coming, because the force of that operation changed the discourse. And the second thing is that young Islamic leaders, I really like to use the word leaders rather than activists. Each one of you is a leader. وكلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته. And every alim, every talib al-ilm, every student, whether of religious or other sciences, is also a leader. And you should think of and you look at these resources available to you to make your case. And so I want to iterate what Dr. Dow has said, that you have to make your point and use TikTok, use Facebook, use social media, whatever, Instagram. Those clips that people in Gaza made of each other, that is what changed the world's opinion. And you do not want to keep the people of Bangladesh ignorant of your narrative. It is the truth, and it is the moral narrative, right? So use that. And the world, not just people in Bangladesh, but people in the world, people in the Ummah should know what's happening. So use that as a way to, if you will, take leadership of Islam and of the narrative in Bangladesh. So now to your question of Islamism and post-Islamism. No, I personally believe that this idea of post-Islamism comes out of frustrated social scientists in the West who do not know either the street, and they can't do anything other than try to get ahead of the curve by making wild guesses. So Islamism itself is misconstrued. First of all, the term is created, of course, even it's embraced by people within the Islamic movement as a way to distinguish themselves. But that's a practical term, but it's also a lazy term that's nearly impossible to define. And across the 50 plus Muslim countries, you have middle class people. When I say middle class, meaning people who are not ulama by profession and who are not secularists, that's the majority of the Muslim Ummah, has come together to demand its rights and to demand representation in politics. That's Islamism. That's the majority of the Ummah. And so, And it has taken many, many different forms. There are all kinds of debates within people who are demanding Islam, and that diversity is good. That diversity is real. There is not a single doctrine that you can say this is an Islamist doctrine. If you don't believe in it, you're not an Islamist, but you're still a Muslim, right? So nearly everything that so-called Islamists say has been said by people that are not identified as Islamists, the ulama, the great thinkers, philosophers. I'm thinking. So if you're talking in South Asia, you can look at Maududi and you can look at Iqbal and you can look at Taqi Usmani and you can look at Rafi Usmani and Maulana Madni. Their differences are not in such that you can say this is Islamism and those people are not Islamists. It's a rather a successful movement like Abu al-Maudi rahimah presided over, that creates a need for people to be able to isolate it, especially outsiders. And the key word that I want to leave with you in this is securitization. Since particularly after global war on terror, which really has been a campaign of American terror in the world, and it's kind of like a license of terrorizing Muslim populations around the world that was given as a result of this global war on terror. What we are seeing in Israel or in many Muslim countries controlling their population, or China, is really an effect of global war on terror. That said, Muslims need to fight back of this securitization of Islam, that Islam becomes a security issue. And this is why Islamism becomes really important for people, because it is seen as that, you can take any demand, any demand for right and dignity and justice and label it Islamism, so that the Muslim that is left after that, outside of Islamism, is either a non-Muslim or a scared Muslim or in prison or dead. So I think that we should fight back against this lazy and not lazy, but nefarious line drawing between Muslims and Islamists. All Muslims who know their deen, who want Islam to be want to put Islam to work, are Islamists, and therefore the term becomes useless. So that said, now post-Islamism is a fanciful idea that Muslims are going to follow Christian Democrats in Europe in neutralizing their any specific religious specific claims, and they're just going to demand a secular public sphere. Something like this did happen in Tunisia after the Arab Spring, because in particular people like Rashid al-Ghannouchi, who is imprisoned, advocated this kind of change. And similarly, the idea was that Islamists are going to stop demanding major transformations to the nation-state structure and simply going to demand certain Republican values as effectively, they're going to become the Republican Party. They're going to be Democrats and liberals and progressives, and they're going to be conservatives and Republicans, and basically recreating the world as in America's image. So in a fanciful leftist kind of way, this is just Fukuyama's end of history thesis coming back again. So I think that this what we are seeing in Gaza, what we have seen in Syria, what we saw in the Arab Spring, which again started as a non-religious movement at first, but then immediately became religious because that is the nature of Muslim societies. And then at first it seemed to have failed, but we are seeing what is happening in Gaza and what we saw what happened in Syria and in Bangladesh. As people become Muslims, become liberated, the face of Islam and Islamism, whatever you call it, is going to change. Islam will become more and more assertive. Is going to become more and more the norm. And if Islam becomes a norm in a society, it can happen in two ways. One, because Islam has given up, or because society has given up, right? And I think that is the real question. Do people who, the ulama and the leaders of Islam, do they accept the nation state and capitalism and secularism as, well, this is Islam, and therefore we don't need to be Islamists anymore because this is what we wanted. All we wanted was that, there is some maybe censorship of books and perhaps, we can get a hijabi person in the parliament or Congress or what have you, and that's all we want. That's effectively, if that happens, that you have given up on all these claims of wanting truth and justice and a better world and caring more about standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if you hold on to those claims, which I believe we must, then it is not Islam that must give up, right? So Islam becomes normal, and this is the final point I'll make. If Islam becomes normal in a society, right? Let's say you have an Islamic government in Bangladesh. Well, the response to that, what's going to happen after that is not that Islamic parties are going to dissolve themselves, but rather they should now become guardians of this, of rights, Islamic rights for people. They should become critics of those in power, because no matter how righteous they are going to overstep their boundaries. And you should become the voice in Islamic. Again, Islam provides a way of life, not a path to government. And so if tomorrow there is a khilafah established in the world and all Muslim countries are united, and there is a great power and there is a great economic unity and integration, and Muslims can move from one place to another, that would be great. That is possible and that is great, but you will still need Islamic parties to make sure that every local and government, regional government, and the khilafah, the imam, the khalifa, whatever we call them, is doing what they're supposed to do. And they should become, as the ulama were historically. The ulama were the biggest champions of khilafah when the khulafa, when they were losing power, but as soon as when they were in power, the ulama were their biggest critics. And I believe that is, so the activity of Islam in the public and social sphere cannot end. That's just the nature of Islam.
Okay, I think we're short of time, so we have to end the program. Before I pass the floor to Brother Hamidul Rashid Jamil, who is going to end the program formally, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Tanzeen Doha and Dr. Waimi Anjum. Dr. Doha is a close brother to me, but Dr. Anjum is my favorite author. I mean, his book, Politics, Community, and Politics, Law, and Community, was suggested to me by Dr. Osama Al-Azami, like 5 or 6 years ago. And since then, I have been reading Dr. Anjum's articles. He's really close to me, and Dr. Anjum, I want to say that I love you for the sake of Allah. So now I want to pass the
I
floor
love you
to
too, my brother.
I want to pass the floor to Brother Hamidul Rashid Jamil. Yeah, Assalamu alaikum.
ওয়ালাইকুম আসসালাম ওয়া রাহমাতুল্লাহি ওয়া বারাকাতুহু। আলহামদুলিল্লাহ, ওয়ালাইকুম আসসালাম ওয়া রাহমাতুল্লাহি ওয়া বারাকাতুহু। Alhamdulillah, we have reached the end of today's program, Reimagining Islamic Political Thought. On behalf of the Dhaka University program, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed speakers, Dr. Anjum and Dr. Tanzin Doha, for sharing their invaluable insights. Your contributions have truly enlightened us and inspired deep reflection on this important topic. I'd also like to thank all the participants who joined us on Facebook Live and Zoom. Your presence and engagement made this event meaningful. Finally, we pray that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala grants us the wisdom to apply the knowledge we have gained today and to work towards in a just and equitable society rooted in Islamic principles. We formally conclude the program. May Allah Subhanahu wa Taala bless you all. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum
Walaikum
assalam. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Jazakumullah khairan. Ustad.
Yeah.